So, my man and I shared an apartment for a while and it seemed pretty normal. After a while, things became hectic in the relationship and I moved out and we were broken up for about 9 months or so before I moved back in and worked things out. During my time away, he told me he had 2 friends of his move in and stay temporarily. Cool. Here is where it gets weird. Once I moved back in, the comfort in the apartment wasn't the same. I felt like I was being watched. Walking past the bathroom was highly uncomfortable, and I swore I would see shadows dancing in the hall while I sat in the living room. I would shut the bedroom doors to both bedrooms, thinking that maybe it was the light from outside reflecting the shadows of the trees into the hall. But no, sir. It continued. I brushed it off for a while and thought my imagination had gotten the best of me. Until one night. We were in our bedroom and I was sitting on the edge of the bed. I looked over his shoulder and in the hall, I saw a pitch black shadow of a child run from the front of the apartment into the bedroom down the hall. I shot up and went to the bedroom, and what do you know? No one there. I told him about it and he simply said it was my imagination. He doesn't believe of things in the paranormal nature. A few days later, his daughter was dropped off. She played in the other bedroom. She got quiet and then came into the living room where we sat and proceeded to ask him, "Daddy, whose baby was that in the hallway?" At this point, I was kind of happy but confused. Happy because I wasn't the only one. Confused because I saw a child, not a baby. Yet, once again, he ignored it and said it was just us. But then, we often sat together in the living room, watching movies. One day we heard noises and I told him there was something wrong. Something was in the apartment. And to my satisfaction, he experienced it. He saw a man, also a dark shadow, just like the baby and child. The door to his daughter's room opened, and then it closed. She was not there this time. She was with her mother. The door handle jiggled until he got to the door, and then it stopped. This shadow would peek around corners, stand in the hall and watch us, and just frightened the hell out of me. He apologized for not believing, and he was a lifelong skeptic that had been proven wrong. He told his friend that he had lived there for some time before I moved back. His friend casually said, "Oh, things like that follow me around and have since childhood. I guess I left one behind." I became angry. I think some things should be shared with someone when you move into their home, you know? I snore, I sleepwalk. Casper is my first cousin and we're pretty close. Those kinds of things. We moved, but I'm still confused. Like, was it a baby, child, or a man? Did it appear to us in different forms? Was it actually 3 and not 1? But in our new place, we get the feeling we haven't moved here alone. So is it now attached to us? I still have so many questions. Hey everyone. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience and my husband doesn't believe me. But last night, he had a very similar experience and now we're both wondering what we could have possibly seen. Our puppy was barking to go outside to use the bathroom. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning. I took him out back and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want to get my feet wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and saw something across the yard. It was slowly walking toward me, like 1 step at a time, and its eyes were super reflective of my phone's flashlight. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring straight at me. It wasn't running away, but walking closer. I hurried the dog up, and we ran inside. I have reoccurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thought it was just that. But I was crying and shaking and could barely talk about it. He told me it was probably a deer, but I just wasn't convinced. I refused to take the dog out after midnight, though. Early this morning, about 5 in the morning, the dog was barking and he took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck stairs. He didn't have his glasses, but he said when he looked up, he saw something tall standing in the forest part of our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, like it was almost gliding. He said as soon as he noticed it, he got a nosebleed. My husband is typically prone to nosebleeds, but hasn't had one since the season has changed. He said he wanted to get a closer look, but felt like he needed to go inside instead, like instinctually. So he ran in. My husband also happens to be a zookeeper, and he isn't really afraid of animals. He works with giraffes and elephants, and says this creature was definitely bigger than any deer. We've been trying to search what else it could be, but are coming up with nothing. Any ideas? Oh, and for reference, we live in eastern Pennsylvania. If you need to be more specific or take a picture of my yard for reference, just let me know. This happened 3 years ago, during mid-July. I lived in Montana, outside of a rural community with a population of about 2,000. During this time, I lived in a small one-floor ranch home by myself. My nearest neighbor lived 1 mile away and was a farmer. I never had many strange encounters leading up to this one, but the woods by my house had always an ominous feel to them. Soon after moving in, I realized why the previous homeowners left pretty quickly. I'd start to hear noises in the woods. These weren't just any noises, but what sounded like blood-curdling screams and growls. After doing some research, I learned that even something like a raccoon or bobcat can make these unnatural noises, and chalked it up to being that. But still, it just never felt right, you know? It's hard to explain. But I never felt like this before, and it was just something about the woods around my house that made me uncomfortable. Like I was always being watched. The first experience, I couldn't explain what happened, but it happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. There was a thunderstorm, and the thunder was loud enough to keep me awake. The lightning was crazy and would light up the whole surrounding area for just a fraction of a second. I was lying on the couch and got up to get a glass and drink at the sink. It was about 2 a.m. if I recall correctly. Above it, there's a small window that gives a view of my yard leading up to the tree line. When the next flash of lightning hit, I saw it. Admittedly, it wasn't a long view, but it gave me enough time to see whatever this thing was. It was near the tree line, just a few steps into my yard. First thought was that it was a bear, but it wasn't. It was standing on 2 legs with its face pointed towards the house. Its legs were haunched like a dog's, and I could clearly make out the hocks. It was hard to tell the color of the fur, but it was dark. Its upper body was massive, with a wide torso, and arms that could almost reach the ground from standing. The strangest thing is how the upper body seemed to dwarf the lower body. After standing there, frozen in shock, I waited for the next lightning strike. But when it happened, it wasn't there. It happened so quickly and was gone so quickly. After that, I bought a gun and would sleep with it within arm's reach. The next encounter is what I consider the most frightening thing of my life. For several weeks, nothing worth noting happened. I don't get cable where I live, and one night I was watching something and my satellite kept acting up. I didn't like going outside at night, but this would be quick. I just had to move the antenna a little bit. Nothing had happened for a few weeks, so I decided to just go out and do it. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and went out. The first thing I noticed was the eerie quietness that surrounded me. This time of year at night, the woods are active with all types of creatures. Not tonight though. Despite the fear I was developing, I made my way over to the satellite and began to adjust it. I heard a small snap of a stick and quickly turned to my left and shined the light towards the direction of the noise. What I saw will horrify me for the rest of my life. I was immediately met with red eyes. These eyes were color of blood, and they were evil. The head of this thing looked like a mutated German Shepherd. I don't like to say it, but it looked like a werewolf. A long snout and pointed ears. The fur was black and shaggy in some places. I could see this creature's extremely developed muscles, and it dwarfed even the biggest humans on Earth. It was half in and half out of the woods, almost crouching, and it still came up to my head at 6 feet. Fully standing, this thing would have been 8 feet, I estimated. I was about 20 feet from this thing. I didn't even consider my gun, which I thought to protect me. Chances are, in hindsight, the little .223 bullets would have just pissed this thing off before it tore me to shreds. I backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact with it. I gently picked up my gun, and my fight or flight reflexes kicked in. I chose flight. Maybe not the best option, but even if I stayed there, this thing would have killed me. I ran the fastest I have ever in my life and didn't turn back once. I have no idea if it was pursuing me. I got in the house though, and I locked every door, window, and covered the blinds and sat with my back against the wall, cradling the gun the entire night. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and very few the following days to come. To make a long story short, I don't live there anymore. People often talk about Sasquatch being harmonious with nature and living within the ecosystem. Sure, if you see one, it might seem scary, but it's probably more awe than anything. With this thing, though, it was totally different. It felt unnatural. It was sinister. It felt evil. It was stalking me, toying with me, and I believe it would have killed me given the chance. I have never seen nor experienced this feeling again in my life. It's a memory I try to put past me, but I still get nightmares about it. I think until the day I die, I will always have the image burned deep into my memory. The best image I have seen that fits the description of the creature are the werewolves from the movie The Howling. My uncle lives in West Virginia, one of the more remote states in the eastern United States. While his main house is in town, he also has a small cabin up on Spruce Knob where he and my aunt would go during the summer. This cabin is very remote and accessed only by jeep trails and is not connected to an electrical grid. So, my aunt and uncle decided to take advantage of a 3-day weekend sometime in the late 80s and headed out to the cabin for some fly fishing and relaxation in the woods. When they arrived, my aunt went out to sketch some, while my uncle unpacked and built a fire in the fireplace, as it was already getting dark. As night began to fall, my uncle noted how unusually quiet the woods were. He has been camping, canoeing, and backpacking all over the world, and he still says that this is the quietest he has even ever heard them. He and my aunt packed everything up and went to bed late, sometime around midnight. My uncle awoke to a strange thumping and scratching noise coming from outside. He thought it was probably a bear or coyotes trying to get at a dog, and he grabbed his gun to go deal with it. As he pulled the gun out from its case, the door on the outside swung open, and a large hairy shape, vaguely humanoid shape, appeared, silhouetted in the moonlight. He said he never quite got a good look at it, but the one thing he really remembers is the overpowering smell, a stench of decay, and 2 glowing yellow eyes. He quickly emptied the gun, and while he didn't get a kill shot, he did scratch the beast's arm, which caused it to run squealing into the woods. He and my aunt immediately grabbed their things, got in their Bronco, and hightailed it out of there. Whatever my uncle saw never really bothered them again, and when he returned in the morning, with more people and firepower, he found very little evidence of any intrusion, except for a single strange clawed footprint in front of the cabin, and claw marks on the door. I don't really know whether to believe my uncle or not, as he is known for telling tall tales. However, unlike his other stories, he was completely serious when he told this one, and my aunt even backed him up. This story has always deeply disturbed me, as I too spend a lot of time in the woods. I will be making a trip up to their cabin this summer, so maybe, just maybe, I will see this same strange beast. I live in Washington, and Bigfoot stories are common. Today, my elderly coworker overheard my other coworker and I talking about Bigfoot encounters, and she began to tell us about hers, or at least she thinks it might have been a Bigfoot. Now, I am close to my coworkers, and we tell each other everything about our personal lives, and I have no reason to not believe her. She said she was camping with her husband when she saw a creature across the river from them. She said she also had her dog with her, and it was upset and growling, which was apparently uncommon for this dog. The way she described this creature was that it was about 7 feet tall with scraggly fur all the way down its body. She then went to the trailer to grab their shotgun when her husband also noticed the same creature. They then watched it as it ran through a clearing and disappeared. The thing she said that spooked me a little bit is when she said, "It could have been watching us for days. I don't know, but the dog knew." I was thinking it was a normal Bigfoot story until she described it as scraggly. Could it have been something other than a Bigfoot? Or maybe a Dogman? What do you think? So, timeline. This was around 2015. Not quite sure the month, but it was around 11 at night. I was driving from my dad's place to my mom's. I've said this a couple of times now, but my dad has 75 acres of spooky-ass land where most of any of my stories will take place. Anyway, I was driving. I had just started down the long driveway when I felt like I was being watched. Not cool, but it happens more often than you would believe. I'm nearing the highway when I see a dark shape at the edge of the woods. Oh well, probably a deer. I shake it off. We have tons of wildlife in the area, from deer to panthers to the occasional bear. And then it starts chasing me. Keep in mind, please, that this shit is practically normal in my mind. I have tons of weird stuff that happens, and it's not like it was just barreling at me. It just moved after my car, staying at the edge of the woods. So, I keep my pace. I turn onto the highway, and I speed up to about 50 or so. But I keep noticing something in my peripheral, so I slow down and start looking for what it could be. A few yards behind me, I see this huge dog. I grew up with larger dogs. My aunt had a St. Bernard mix growing up, and I've had various other large dogs. This thing was literally the size of my car. I know I mentioned bears before, but bears don't chase cars, and we only ever have black bears, which are like the most docile kind unless threatened, or they have their young around. Okay, so now I'm freaking out. I gun it, releasing a long stream of curses and telling my car to get over it. It was a poorly kept 95 Honda Accord, and I had tons of trouble with it dying on me. So any time I had to push it, I made sure to speak kindly to it, since I didn't care at this point. I was simply trying not to die. I seemingly can't shake it for too long, so in an act of bravery and real stupidity, I pull over in a church parking lot, thinking maybe it's some sort of hell beast and it won't come into the light or onto church land. Holy shit, was I wrong. I stop and get my phone out to call my boyfriend. In that span of time, it catches up and jumps onto my car. I can see and feel and hear the metal popping and creaking, and I see drool splatter onto my windshield. I scream, dropping my phone. It jumps off my car onto the hood, where I get a glimpse of it before it goes into the cemetery and disappears. It was definitely a dog, built like a Rottweiler pit mix, but darker and larger. It was solid black, with paws the size of dinner plates. It had a huge head, almost the size of my car windows. I don't know why it decided to leave me alone, but it did, and I'm thankful. I called my boyfriend, hysterically crying. He calmed me down and listened, and told me that when I got home I should take pictures. And I did, or tried to at least. By the time I got to my mom's, the only thing left was a single dent in the roof of my car, and some faint claw marks that were more like indentations in the metal. Sorry guys, I don't have the pictures anymore. So I guess, if anything, it was either a hellhound or a dogman. You decide. I used to live in Eugene, Oregon, and about 6 years ago, my friend and I saw something unexplainable. We were driving down a country road to a friend's house when I saw something in the middle of the road. It at first appeared to be a large dog. Having grown up with mastiffs, I became worried about the animal. As we got closer, I began to feel a chill down my spine and an uneasiness as it was dusk, but I did not have my car lights on, but could see the animal clearly still. It was the height of a deer with a curved spine and long, thin legs. When it moved, it appears as if the animal's bones were broken, and the movements were so unnatural, but the animal made no cries of pain or appeared to be hurt. The animal had black fur that looked like the worst mange I have ever seen. The naked patches of skin looked wrong, and the bones pushed out from under it. The animal finally turned to look at my car. It had a long nose and was drooling from its open mouth, where there appeared to be large canines. We didn't speak because as it turned to look at us, its eyes were glowing red. I know, it sounds like bullshit from a fake ghost story, but I promise you, this is what they were. This is what I saw. My headlights were not on to illuminate the animal's eyes like that. It crossed slowly in front of my car, and as it disappeared over the side, my passenger yelled to pull up and see what the hell that was. As I pulled up, the animal was gone, and there was only a small drainage pipe and an open field beyond that. We got to our friend's house, and after some prying to him and his parents what we had seen, his father simply chucked and said, "Oh, we see those out here sometimes," and continued to eat dinner. Has anyone else seen something similar to this at close range? If my passenger hadn't been there, I would have thought my imagination got the best of me. I am lucky to know that what I saw was real, and in my opinion, unexplainable. Could it have been a skinwalker? I have no idea. In a small town, rural Tennessee, kids played outside until there was no light to be seen by, and even then, they found ways to stay out until they were brought inside by threat of punishment. I was no exception. One Saturday evening, when I was 2 months into turning 12, as I was coming inside from playing, I was stopped in my tracks by a strange sound, a mix of yipping, growling, and into a barking growl. Coming from an easy 30 or so yards, I was intrigued. I stood on the front porch, looking into the tree line their house faced, trying to find the source of the sound. I expected a dog to emerge, as people were always dumping their dogs in the country, and it was rare that these animals ever found homes. Most of them just roamed the woods. Sitting down on the porch steps, I waited for what I thought would be one of these dogs, but nothing. After a solid 10 minutes, and a loss of more of the dwindling light, I stood to go inside. The sound came again, this time though, deeper and much more guttural. It chilled me. This sound. Looking out into the trees, I saw a very tall figure move in between. It was taller than the fence outlining the trees, and those are a good 4 to 5 feet. I took hold of the door. The sound came again, and it felt it go right through me. It's difficult to explain. I felt as if it rooted me to the spot. I opened the door and moved to step inside. My eyes were locked on the spot where this thing had moved toward the fence. I saw a slice of what looked like a shadow coming to life, and put a hand on the fence. I didn't wait for more. I stepped inside the house and closed the door after me. I've never spoken of this to any other person before now. Although I've never doubted what I saw, I never had a name for it. I saw no real features other than a vague outline, but what prompted me to share this were the details of that outline. It had arms of impossible length, and 2 ears on the side of its head that were long and slender. Its upper torso was broad along the shoulders and tapered down. I could not see the legs for the fence, nor the feet. I never heard the term Dogman until a month or so ago, and I haven't been in 12 for several long years now, but I know that's what I saw out in the tree line. What else could it have been? My late wife Samantha had just given birth to her 3rd child, and her labor was exhausting, so she stayed home a few days to recover from the birth. After a week or so, she decided to take the baby to visit her mother, which was 20 minutes away, through a rural area. To get there and back, she had to take a rural 2-lane blacktop road called Riddle Road in Jefferson County, Illinois. She decided to start heading home around 3 p.m. as to make it home before dark, and as she was driving along, she seen what she thought to be a tall man standing next to the road, and she started to slow down, just in case the man stepped into the road. As she got closer, she soon realized that it wasn't a man at all, but a tall creature covered with jet black fur. This shocked her, and as she came upon the creature, she slowed her car down almost to a stop, thinking it was someone wearing a really well-made Halloween costume, since it was mid-October. But immediately, it was clear that it was not a costume at all. She said the creature was around 7 feet tall with jet black fur and yellowish golden eyes, and standing on dog type 2 legs. She went on to say it was like a bodybuilder, and she could see its extremely muscled body through the thinner areas of fur. She said that it had hands with long fingers instead of paws. She stopped within 20 feet of this creature due to the pure shock of seeing it there standing next to the road. She could see its breath in the cold air, and its fur was moving with the wind, and it, without a doubt, was a living, breathing animal. She and it just stared at each other for what she said felt like 20 minutes, but was more likely less than a minute or two. Finally, she said it smiled. Yes, it smiled at her, and that was more than she could handle, and she pushed the pedal to the metal, as they say. She looked in her rearview mirror, and as she drove away, she said that it walked on across the road and into a cornfield on the opposite side. And yes, it walked on 2 legs. I know the story sounds fake, and it doesn't matter if anyone believes it. But if you knew her and heard her tell you the exact same story over and over again without any changes to it, you would probably think twice about taking Riddle Road alone. This happened to me back when I was just a little boy, back in the early 1980s. Quick info about me. At the time of this happening, I was living at my grandmother's house with my grandmother, due to my parents having a volatile relationship, and it wasn't safe for me to be there. That's a whole other nightmare, but I'll focus on this one today. Because she really didn't have a spare room, per se, I would sleep out in the living room on her big couch. Facing the couch across the living room is a little reading nook area with 3 big windows that were all angled. Laying on the couch, I could look over to my right and look directly out the windows that were maybe 20 feet away. Anyway, One night, I was lying asleep when I felt awakened by something. For some reason, I thought to turn to my right, like my instincts were screaming danger. I looked to my right, and there was this extremely tall gray figure with glowing red eyes staring at me through the nook area. I remember screaming as loud as I could, and my grandmother about burst down the stairs in frantic and in a total panic. I was hysterical and told her what I had just seen. She chalked it up to being a bad nightmare and just pinned a blanket over the windows. I don't know how much longer it continued to watch me, but after I started screaming, and by the time my grandmother got downstairs, it was gone. For the next 3 months, I would stay there. I would always pin the blanket back up over that nook window once it got dark. I couldn't sleep unless it was up. I always felt like in the back of my mind it was watching me through the blanket still, wanting me to come outside. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering it, and it scared me so bad. I don't exactly remember where my grandmother lived because she passed away shortly after I turned 13. But I do remember that she lived way west of New York State. In fact, I think she wasn't too far from Pennsylvania to be exact, but I can't exactly remember how far. Date 2015. Location Wise River, Montana. Weather humid, summer night, around 11:30 p.m. I lived alone, and in this remote location, we don't have cable, so the only option is satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up again, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet. I also had purchased an AR due to other sightings I've had, but they weren't credible enough to chalk it up as a Dogman. Like, so silent it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which is in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure all the wires were all right and pointing to it a different angle. Suddenly, I hear a small snap of a stick to my left and turn the flashlight to the direction, and I saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at for what seemed like an eternity, but was for only about 10 seconds. I slowly backed off and ran back to the house and locked all my doors and windows. This creature was unlike anything I have ever seen before. When I shined light at it, the first thing I noticed was the head. It had cropped ears that pointed upwards. Its snout was more narrow than a bear and longer, and I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light I was pointing at. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs, broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which looked similar to a dog's legs. It had obvious hocks. Even the crouched position, it was about my height, which is 6 foot. Standing up to full height, this creature could have easily been 7.5 to 8 feet tall. The fur was so black and thicker on the neck and chest, and the bottom half significantly less so. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I know is I had a feeling of dread unlike anything I've experienced. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without me noticing. All I knew was I needed to get out of there and not find out. I don't live on the property anymore, but after the event, I never had another face-to-face encounter. But I would hear sounds in the woods I could not explain. They would usually start off relatively quiet and work their way up to furious screams and then back down to quiet again. I don't know if this was the same thing because it could be local wildlife. The location this encounter took place is 61720 Montana Highway 43 Wise River, in case you want to search up the location on Google Maps. I have a short story to share with you. My dad was recently chased out of the woods by what he describes as the largest wolf he's ever seen in his life. I'm really into paranormal and cryptids, so when he told me about this, I was heavily intrigued and pushed for answers. He doesn't like talking about it because it really scared him. I'm not sure what he saw out there, but whatever it was really spooked him. And my dad isn't one to be scared easily. He's been through a lot in life: prison, knife fights, gangbanging, drug dealing. He's been face to face with death, and he told me he's never felt fear like he did when this thing charged him. The best way he could explain it to me was a big black dog with a hunched back, overly sharp teeth, and too many teeth for its mouth to be exact, and piercing eyes charged at him as he approached the carcass of a 3-point buck that was virtually left unscathed on the ground. He said as he approached the carcass, he began to hear noise to his left, and out of the clearing this dog just started running him down. He said he's never, ever had his fight or flight senses hit him so heavily at once, so he ran. He believes it only to be a bluff charge and made him run his 3/4 of a mile back to his truck. What my dad doesn't understand is why would there be a dead buck in a clearing like that? It wasn't being eaten on, it was just lying there like it was freshly killed somehow. Why did this dog chase him away? Was it planning on eating it? Sorry this is short, I just thought I'd like to share this with you. Howdy everybody. My family has a fairly strange relationship with the Dogman in the southeastern region of the United States. I've always lived around MD, but my family originally started off in Louisiana. My family were, as my grandpa put it, carne entrepreneurs. Best way I can put his accent into text. Anyway, our family arrived from Cuba and started our little carnival act, which I'm happy to say isn't still in action, around 1898. They would travel throughout the South, performing and doing work on defunct plantations and farms. During this time, my great-great, well, you get the point, grandfather came into contact with a local Native American tribe. He never really talked about it, but shortly after my family started having contact with Dogman. My grandfather, back when they were still traveling with the carnival, talked about seeing the beast walking around their camps at night. He has a bunch of stories that I might talk about later, but he suffers from dementia pretty heavily, so you'll have to take them with a grain of salt. My dad worked for a while in the telephone industry, putting up poles. He was up doing maintenance one night on Gambrel Mountain. As he was driving back down the mountain, he saw about 3 dogmen running alongside his truck and staring at him through his windows. My experiences are a bit more involved. I've been hunting in the mountains around where I live for quite a while now, and every time I head out I see one of them. Typically, they're just off in the distance, or just walking around the riverbanks, fetching water. I wanted to know if anybody else has any sort of explanation as to maybe why they seem to be following my family around. I was out setting up a deer stand a couple years back. Had to hike in and find the perfect tree for it. Made sure I had a lot of clearing and such. I saw something across the mini canyon by me that I just can't explain. It was a tall, upright figure, all black but appeared to have a snout and perky ears. I don't know what I was looking at. Whatever it was watching me through the trees at first, and then I noticed that it was looking at me. It continued to stare me down, and then somehow seemingly disappeared into the brush. It was strange. I've never seen an animal that looked anything like that before. I wrote it off at first as just a big black bear watching me, but it didn't look right. It was much more skinny and looked more dog than bear. I went back to that area and hunted for the season and had no issues again, but sometimes I wonder if there's any animals that have never been discovered here in Oklahoma. This happened when I was much younger. I'd have to ask my parents when the camping trip happened just to tell you how many years ago it was. But I could assure you it was at least a decade. Now I'm going to use some questionable words for describing the location. Words like wooded and wilderness reserve, because I don't know the best words for these things. Around a decade ago, a friend from church asked me to join his family on a camping trip to a wilderness reserve called Oasis State Park. Of course, since this was my best friend and his family, and they had always been nice, I said yes. Up until that point, I had only camped rarely, so the prospect of camping with a friend and his family seemed absolutely amazing. So we began preparing for a weekend when I wasn't busy. I got my own tent, my own sleeping bag, and all my own supplies. Once all that was gathered, the father of the friend came and picked me up, and my parents waved me off. There are quite a few things I remember from that trip. The amazing hostile yet beautiful New Mexico countryside, the plateaus, and the campsite. The New Mexican wilderness isn't something a lot of people fantasize about camping in, at least not so far as I know. But Oasis State Park is different. The camping plots are all nice, even if the best are always taken. There's a pretty lake, lots of wildlife, and I hate to admit, more trees than I have ever seen in town. Yeah, I know nobody thinks of multitude of trees when they think of New Mexico, and for good reason. They aren't the most common occurrence in the plains unless planted by people. Regardless, Oasis has enough for me to just use the term woods for the sake of brevity. So, anyway, we found ourselves a plot and began setting up our tents. By afternoon, the tents were set, and me and my friend ditched his oh, so boring, younger sister in favor of exploring the park. The memories are fantastic. We found a snake by the lake and watched it drink from the water before slithering off quickly. We explored a place I remember was very sandy. We watched a roadrunner doing its thing. We played all day after lunch and saw so many amazing things that by the end of the day, I never would have thought anything could have gone wrong. We finished the day like we always did, by collecting sticks and starting a fire to eat s'mores and whatnot, and of course, tell ghost stories. None of the stories were scary, probably because me and my friend were kids, and his sister was even younger, and his father was the lead singer at our church. Making the children cry was bad for reputation. So, by ghost stories, I mean little jokes of stories designed to make us giggle more than cry. Yeah, it was lame, but I mean, what do you expect? Anyway, shortly after the stories were said and s'mores were eaten, we retired. Me to my tent, and my friend, his father, and his current sister to their tent. Now, for this setup, I'll explain further positioning. This is all going to be important. My tent was at one edge of the plot, and my friend's tent was at the exact opposite. This was for privacy reasons. Now at my end of the plot was a mini trail that led through thick brush to the lake. Also, about 3 feet from my tent was a little tree. I don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was still young and small. The trail to the lake was to the left of my tent entrance, and the lake was behind it, and a thin tree line sat across a trail in front of my tent. that trail in front of my tent led to the bathrooms. So, I went to bed without a single bit of fear. And before I did, I went ahead and urinated on the tree outside my tent just because of laziness. Screw the 2-minute walk to the bathrooms when nature's toilet was outside. So, I finished closing up my tent for the night and climbed into my sleeping bag, just ready to go to bed. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up I had to use the bathroom, and it wasn't the kind of potting I could do on a tree, or at least not reasonably. So I, not being a moron who'd wander through the dark, grabbed my little lantern. I flipped on my LED lantern and I unzipped the inner flap of my tent before the outer, as if that little nylon net could protect me from what I was about to see. Now, I should mention to you that outside of the cities in New Mexico, it's quite common to hear coyote howls. It's a nightly occurrence when camping, actually. Heck, even up in a little village like Logan, you can hear the howls from your bedroom. It isn't so unnerving when you're in a house, but when you got some flimsy nylon walls to protect you and that's it, well, it isn't the most comforting sound. As I unzipped my tent flap, I did hear a few howls, but they were distant and not worrying. What stunned me into stillness was a very loud howl from the direction of the lake, about a yard from my tent at most. This howl was different though. It had the feel of a coyote howl, but it was deeper, and it lasted longer. I simply sat there, petrified at what I had heard. I wouldn't be able to guess at how long I sat there, breathing hard with my fingers, still grasping at the zipper. But however long it may have been was just long enough for the thing that made the howl to come up the trail next to my tent. Suddenly, I heard the crunching of claws on dirt, and after that, claws on the rocks that made our camping plots. Then I saw the largest shadow made by a living creature that little kid me had ever seen. It lumbered heavily in the direction of the sparse tree line where I assumed the other howling had come from. But before it got past the tree I urinated on, it stopped. I realized only then that I was both lit like a candle and had not been trying to silence my heaving breathing. By then it was too late, as that hulking thing lumbered over closer to the tree and into the light of my lantern. As dim as the little LED light was at that distance, it was just barely enough to make out details. I'd like to note a very few important details that stuck out to me as odd. It had roughly the fur coloring of a coyote, but that classic Dogman head shape with the tiny pointed ears too small to make sense. It also made strange noises as it lowered to all fours in front of my tent. Popping sounds like joints rubbing together, as I can only assume its knees busted out of their standing joints and fell into different joints to support all fours. It briefly ignored the very obviously frightened kid, me, in my tent, as it sniffed the tree I had urinated on earlier. The breasts were similar to a dog's, but longer and far deeper, almost like a horse's. Then, that thing turned to me and stared straight into my eyes. Its eyes didn't glow. They didn't peer into my soul, but they were unbelievably unnatural. Above all the things I saw in those eyes, I saw a predator. Have you ever been in a position where you made eye contact with a beast you know is stronger than you? Something you know could just slaughter you, and you know it knows that you know. Just looking for seemingly so damn long that I thought for sure I'd just be a bloody stain by the time anyone reached my tent. Screaming would get me nowhere. I doubted a gun would even hurt this thing. But despite every feeling in my gut, despite the dread of knowing it was a predator and I was prey, I didn't die. Instead it turned, slowly, ever so slowly, and just sprinted off into the woods. Just gone into the night faster than it came. I have one personal friend who knows, and he jokes that made it was my piss on that tree. Like I marked my territory or something dumb like that. Or maybe it just wasn't hungry. Or, most improbable, it had just enough morals to not kill a kid. I'll never really know. Needless to say, I don't go to the bathroom. I just put my lantern away, closed my tent flap, and held it in all night. I don't remember sleeping that night. I might have, I might not. But if I did, it was dreamless. I do remember that I tried to hide this experience the next day, asking if my friend and his family heard any howling. While they did hear the howling, they told me they just ignored it, thinking it was a coyote doing coyote stuff. I was encouraged to just ignore it as if I was a city kid who had never heard a coyote howling before. The next day, I stayed as close to my friend as possible while exploring and had nearly forgotten the encounter by lunch. Somehow, the safety I had been feeling during the day put the beast out of my mind, until we found tracks in that super sandy place. Coyote tracks. I think seeing those tracks confirmed to me that it wasn't just some dream. And because of that, I showed enough fear that night to convince my friend's family to let me sleep in their tent. Even in the comfort of a warmer tent, and in the presence of an adult and 2 other people, I still couldn't sleep that night. I'd nearly drift into sleep and then I'd hear a howl. The next day I pretended to be sick and got my mother to drive up and take me home a day or 2 early. Worst camping trip of my life. It ruined not only my whole summer, but ruined camping. I haven't been camping without a buddy since, and I don't plan to. Even then I'm never comfortable, always listening for strange noises and acting paranoid. This really fucked me up, I guess. Being forced to see that human, top of the food chain, is utterly powerless in front of such a beast. Seriously, I don't think I can press hard enough to make everyone realize how powerless I felt. Even today when I think about this, I remember 2 things first. Those eyes and that feeling. Just writing this sent multiple shivers up my spine. Alright, everyone. So I had a recent encounter with, well, something. I'm not sure what it was, as I never actually saw it. But the encounter seems to be in line with things I've read here and other places. So, here it goes. It was approximately 2 weeks ago, just before Halloween. Now, let me start by saying I'm not an avid outdoorsman. I love hiking, and I've spent countless hours in my city's 16 square mile state park, nature reserve, whatever you want to call it. But I'm not a mountain man by any means. The park is home to several indigenous mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles. A full pond, thick brush, and even swampy marshes in certain spots. There are designated hiking and biking trails that sprawl the entire area, but there are also several wild areas that aren't really maintained or used well. Being that I have an adventurous streak, and that I also hate being around groups of people, I often find myself in these less ventured or wild areas. Now, it's worth noting that I've never really felt uncomfortable in this park. It's kind of like my safe place. I go there to get away, decompress after work, or just to be alone sometimes. It feels like a second home in a way. Anyway, enough background information. I'm rambling. I just pulled up to one of the less commonly fished ponds, Beaver Lake, and I intended to circle the far side on one of the hiking trails that goes right next to the tree line, and then into the tree line, and then push further back onto one of the old horse trails. Now, this horse trail in particular doesn't get used much more anymore. I can't say why for sure, but I've heard a myriad of different reasons from different people. The most logical explanation is that it's just not as convenient to get to anymore, and it gets pretty marshy when it rains. I'd be able to follow the normal hiking trail for the first 3/4 of a mile, but I'd have to fork left off the trail once it went into the tree line. The gate to the old horse trail was about 500 yards to my 9 o'clock from there, just through an overgrown thicket and up a slight hill. I made my way over the 4-foot gate and started exploring. I had about an hour and a half before sunset, and I have a strict screw the woods at night policy, so I was watching the time. My main goal for this adventure was to snap some pictures of the area for a project that I had been working on, and I'll admit, I was more distracted than I typically am. Anyway, close to an hour had passed. I'd gotten some good shots, and I figured now was a good time for my egress. It'd take me close to 30 minutes to get back to my truck, and I wasn't keen on getting stuck in an unfamiliar area at night. I sat my backpack down on a stump, dropped to one knee, and started packaging and organizing my stuff. I am not sure what the catalyst was, but I suddenly felt this terrible sense of dread. I slowly turned and scanned my surroundings. Nothing seemed out of place. I stood up and grabbed my bag. When I took a step forward, a leaf crunched under my boot, and I realized that everything was dead silent. Now, as I said above, I am not an avid outdoorsman by any means, but I know well enough that silence like this is an indication that a predator is in the area, and you need to quickly but calmly make your way out of the area and stay vigilant. It's worth noting that while mountain lions and black bear are technically indigenous to my area, there have been more than enough caught and relocated for it to be a valid concern. I've been stalked by a mountain lion on one other occasion, and this felt eerily similar, so that was at the forefront of my mind. I'd been moving for probably 5 minutes, and everything seemed fine. I'd lulled myself into believing that I was just overreacting, and that everything was fine. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. Good, right? Well, wrong. By this point, the trail was completely overgrown on both sides. I could see fairly clearly behind me and a decent way ahead, but my left and right may as well have been fall-colored walls. I must have gotten lost in thought for a moment, because I tripped on a root and ate shit. As I was picking myself up, I started hearing a soft, cooing or chittering off to my right. It sounded like a mix between a dove and the predator. It would start with a coo or yelp and end with this weird chittering sound. I'm actually sitting here trying to replicate it, and I sound ridiculous. I'm not sure my throat is even capable of recreating it accurately. Anyway, I'm out of shape and there's no way I'm outrunning anything. So I scrambled up, planted my feet, and tried to make myself look as menacing as a fat 22-year-old with a backpack and glasses can look. About 100 yards ahead of me, which would have originally been behind me had I not fallen, so toward where I was taking the pics was moving away from, I saw the underbrush start to shake, and it sounded like something was tearing through it. I only had maybe 20 minutes of daylight left at this point, and it would take me at least that long to make it way back to my truck. So, I did exactly what you are not supposed to do. Naturally, I turned around and I fucking booked it, knowing good and damned well that I can run for maybe a half mile. 3/4 of a mile if something's trying to kill me, maybe. I could barely hear anything over my own footfalls and the sound of my heart pounding. But whatever it was chasing me through the underbrush, and it was gaining on me. It may have been 15 yards behind me at this point, and I still had a ways to go. I don't know if fear kept me going or what, but I reached the deeper and just kept running. My breathing got shallow, my vision started to blur, and I was honestly about to collapse when I saw the gate to the horse trail about 300 yards ahead of me. This thing is right on top of me by now, and as soon as I came within arm's reach of the gate, I planted my foot on the bottom rung and launched myself over it. My landing was not graceful, I landed on my right shoulder and tumbled several yards down the hill into a puddle of muck. I wasn't thinking straight now, and I stood up shakily and started making my way toward the tree line and pond. I knew what direction to go, and I didn't even bother finding the hiking trail. I just crashed through the brush and overgrowth like some kind of barbarian. I didn't care about the cuts or the scrapes, or even the massive amounts of noise I was making. My only thought was to get out. The chittering noises had stopped, but I still heard something moving in the brush at the top of the hill. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore either. I finally broke through the tree line and could see my truck parked across the pond at the top of the hill. I finally took a deep breath and started slowly walking my way away from the tree line. The ominous feeling had lifted, and I started making my way up the trail alongside the tree line. I was able to catch my breath for about 15 seconds. I heard that god-awful cooing and chittering behind me again, and I turned to look back at the tree line behind me. So at the point, there's a trail leading into the tree line in front of me, tree line to my right, water to my left, and the trail leading alongside the tree line and around the pond to the cars behind me. The underbrush of the tree line ahead of me started to shake and fear took over. I'm thankful that my bag is waterproof and that my phone is water resistant because I jumped in the pond and I swam across. I have never really told this story to anyone in my personal life. They'd probably think I'm crazy, and I doubt they'd consider me reliable or credible, especially given my interest in Bigfoot and cryptids in general. I don't know what was stalking me that day. I know I wound up cold, wet, and a bit shaken up. I also know I've been back at the park, at least at that part of the park, and I can't come up with a good explanation. Beaver Lake is off limits to me for a while. I think I'll just continue exploring and hanging out on the slightly more populated side of the park. I was black powder hunting alone on a private property. The property has a gated entrance, and I parked my four-wheeler there and normally walked in the remaining 200 yards to my elevated deer stand. As I shut my four-wheeler off and put on my backpack, I heard a very large limb snap and thought it was a deer or animal moving around, maybe only 20 yards away. So I didn't think anything about it, gathered my gun and hunting stuff, and started walking down the 2-track trail without my flashlight on, due to having good enough light from the moon to see where I was walking. I hunted here a long time and knew the trail. This trail ended in a 15-acre hayfield surrounded by old-growth timber. As I walked in the dark, I quickly realized something was paralleling my every step just inside the woods. I walked and stopped, and it would do the same. By the time I realized I might have a problem on my hands, it was too late to go back to the four-wheeler. So I picked up my pace and made a beeline for my tree stand. When I got within 10 yards of the stand, I heard another large limb snap really close to the edge of the field on my left. I stopped, turned my flashlight on, and shined that in the direction. I seen 2 glowing green eyes about 10 inches apart. Instinctively, I raised my rifle and stomped my foot at it and yelled, "Get out of here!" Not really sure what I was seeing. It just blinked its eyes once and never moved. I could not make out any details, just that it may have been crouched down due to the proximity of the eyes to the ground. Whatever this was didn't run like most non-predatory animals would. I realized that, in an instant, the best thing to do was bolt up my ladder and get in the stand as quickly as possible. This was no more than 8 steps away, and if I shot at it, I would have been blinded by the muzzle flash, and it might attack if I missed in the dark, and not having a way to reload quickly. I made an evasive move. The rest of the time I waited in the stand for daybreak, it circled my stand, just out of the light shine. Approximately 1 minute before daybreak, I heard bipedal steps go into the woods where it had followed me from. I waited till daylight and quickly made my way back to my four-wheeler. As I jumped on the machine and just before I fired it up, I heard another branch or limb snap loudly in the woods off the trail behind me. I left the area and went back home and cut the week-long hunt short and didn't return until the following spring. I've never hunted the same way again since, and rarely go in before after dark on foot unless I absolutely have to. And if I do, I always have a sidearm. I've since sold that property and hunt in my home state of Indiana, and I could honestly say one thing for sure. If I had had a shotgun or a high-powered rifle in my hand with more than one shot, I felt threatened enough to use it that day. This thing was not scared of me at all, and it changed the way I look at the woods and forests forever. Thinking back on that morning and the days leading up, I now remember that I hadn't seen the normal wildlife signs and visual activity I normally saw. So, this happened back in 2010. I was 10 years old at the time. During this time, it was a snow blizzard. It hit our city out of nowhere, as our weather is known to be bipolar and have late winters. I lived with my cousins during this time. This blizzard went on for a while. Thick snow, freezing. This blizzard was so unexpected that nobody was prepared for it. Powers were going out, people buying out the water supplies in stores. I remember seeing on the news that people were using barbecue grills inside homes for warmth. This mainly occurred in less fortunate areas. Even though we lived in apartments, we were fortunate enough to have our power on and other needed stuff. To sum up how this blizzard was affecting us, it was so cold to the point trees were falling. I lived on a giant pond where if you go on our balcony, it would be water. Well, that was frozen. So me being the 10-year-old I am who doesn't want to play in the snow. So me and my cousin, who was 18 at the time, played out in the snow in the daytime. We practically did that every day whenever we got bored. But one day, him and I went outside in the parking lot, outside my apartment, basically in front of my home. The only difference was we went to go and play in the snow at 6 p.m., and it had already been dark by this time, just because of daylight savings time. We wait until it stops snowing till we go out. So we were playing like normal, building snowmen and walls, anything normal you do in the snow, right? Well, we decided to attempt to make a snow wall, so we needed lots of snow for that. Now, it has been snowing heavy, and where's the best spots to get loads of snow? Off of cars that haven't moved, of course. We start building this wall, and I'm taking snow off of trunks of cars, and there's thick layers. It's the easiest spot to obtain a chunk of snow. After a few back and forward of getting snow off the cars and bringing it to the wall we were building, I notice I haven't touched my sister's boyfriend's car. Wow, that's a lot of snow they haven't left in days. I tell my cousin that let's go get that snow. We were walking towards my sister's boyfriend's car, and we are now at it. We arrive at the trunk, and as soon as I grab a big 2 armful of snow, a very loud click is heard. In confusion, I look around, and then look down and around the car. My cousin and I is a green light in the shape of a circle around us. Now this is freaky enough in the moment. I decided to look up to see what the source of this light was. And what do you know? Nothing was above us. So after noticing the light and nothing being above us, I look at my cousin and start running back home. I'm freaked out, running, looking around everywhere, and as I run home, checking my surroundings, I see a tree fall in the distance. Yeah, it was cold like I mentioned earlier, but this was common during a blizzard. But for this to happen at the moment of this weird phenomenon just adds more chills to the story for me. My cousin and I get inside, and inside was my sister and his sister cooking. We rush in, freaked out, and they're questioning what's wrong. We explained the chain of events that went down, and what do you know? Just like anyone who hears these type of stories, they said we were stupid, crazy, we need to stop playing, etc. Okay, they don't believe us, brush it off. Who would expect anyone to? Now for the rest of that night, my cousin and I just keep peeking out the window very often. Our minds could not clear that. We stayed up all night, kept peeking out the window. We played Black Ops until about 7 a.m., still peeking out the window every 5 minutes. This was not something we were just going to forget, let alone make this up. To this day, he still remembers this moment, a moment that should have been pure, normal fun, into a creepy extraterrestrial sighting, which I believe. I am 18 now, but the details are still clear as day, as I have thought about it often ever since that moment. It is not something you easily forget. My cousin and I talk about this here and there when we see each other, but man oh man, it was a freaky incident. Look, I don't expect you to believe me, but I have had this on my mind for way too long. It is just something too unreal to keep to myself. I have come here to share my experience and I'm looking for thoughts. What are your thoughts? What could it have been? Why did it target us? Why didn't it do anything? To this day, I have one too many unanswered questions, and they will never be answered. I'm just going to have to live with that fact. To paint this picture, I was born in 2002, and my entire childhood, I was obsessed with fairies. At some point, I began to get pieces of paper and write messages to fairies. I would tape them in various fairy places around my house. I had one above my bed, and the last one I put up before I saw the fairies was on a chair on my outside porch. I always wrote asking them to visit me. I remember they finally came one night at 3:10 a.m. I randomly woke up and saw tiny little balls of light around my piles of books I kept in bed. Until this event, I had always pictured fairies looking like little people with wings. One of them, or a few of them, I don't remember, were singing something. I remember the lights were red, orange, and yellow. Unfortunately, although I had always wanted to meet them, after a few seconds I screamed and ran to my parents' room and slept in their bed. The next day I drew pictures of the light and showed it to my parents. I don't think I still have the pictures, but sometime soon I'm going to look around for it. I regretted running away from them, and once college apps are finished, I'm going to spend the winter trying to figure out what happened and if I can contact the fairies again. All of the things I've read online about people meeting fairies describe them as people. Do you think the balls of light were something other than fairies? Additionally, some people think that what happened was a dream since I was into fairies and it happened at night. But y'all gotta trust me that it was really real. This happened to me and my stepbrother around 7 years ago. My grandpa owns about 40 acres of woods, and he took us out there, and he ended up falling asleep. And me and my brother did the most cliche thing. We went to venture in the woods without telling my grandpa. We had walked in for about an hour when we saw a sheet of metal hanging on barbed wire. We were unsettled but curious nonetheless, and by now, we're in deep woods and we see a large tree up ahead. And we run up to it and see dead cows and their insides thrown all over the tree. At this point, we were terrified, and we began to run back the way we came. And as we're running, something was chasing us until we got back to the barbed wire, and it stopped. We made it back and told my grandpa, but of course, he didn't believe us. Fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, and one of my cousins is hunting out there. And they leave their truck overnight as it got stuck in the mud. When they returned, it had been lit on fire 3 to 4 miles in the middle of the woods. I plan on going out there with some friends and a couple of guns. Any advice? This seems like to be the only place I could possibly get some answers. When I was a little boy in the early 90s, I lived in Bandytown in Boone County, West Virginia, and as a kid, I remember being friends with this neighborhood boy who suddenly got snatched up while playing in the woods with his older brother and killed. The older brother claimed while playing he'd watched a huge black cat run up and grab his brother by the head or neck and took off with him. When they found his little body, it was torn up pretty bad from what I'd heard. His neck was broken and his face was partially eaten. But no one really believed the older brother's story about a panther, and officials just chalked it up to a bear attack. Although everyone involved agreed it didn't look like a typical bear mauling, which was common where I was from. They never found the animal during hunting, so parents around the area were definitely a lot more touchy about us playing outside at the time, and no one I knew was allowed to play outside at night anymore because the old folks talked about hearing what sounded like a baby crying or a woman screaming deep in the mountains behind their houses. But a couple months after the boy's funeral, things settled down a bit, and I remember playing around an old empty lot near my home besides this huge mountain. I think I was down on the ground playing with a gardener snake or maybe some bug when I heard something that sounded like grunts and obviously got my attention. I lift my head up and here's this big and slim black panther-like animal standing up from the tall weeds about 20 to 30 feet away behind the fence that blocked the lot from the mountain. This thing was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I can't remember every detail, but its snout was long and chunkier, almost like a dog's, not like a cougar or cheetah, and its tail was very long, and it stayed in this J-like bend shape the entire time. It watched me for a while, not moving an inch and never taking its eyes off me with its head low to the ground and mouth slightly hung open. But my screaming and hollering scared it away, or it lost interest because it didn't take long after I started hollering for it to turn around and shoot back up the side of the mountain and out of sight. Still, to this day, I'd bet everything I own that what I saw was the same thing that had grabbed that little boy, because I only lived like 10 to 15 houses down from where he did and was playing at. I remember back when Monster Quest still came on the History Channel, they did an episode about Appalachian big cats and showed a few shots of supposed Black Panthers seen around the West Virginia and Appalachian area. It really hit me hard and brought up a lot of bad memories, to say the least. Please remember to be respectful. A child's death is never an easy subject. I used to drive a mail truck years ago, but ended up quitting after I broke my hip on the job and had medical complications and couldn't return to work. Probably for the better, because I encountered something on the job that I still can't explain. I moved from Oregon to a little outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, just 10 years ago and started a mail truck job. The route I had was pretty rural, having a rather large loop to drive through. It was pretty woodsy, and I would always get this really bad feeling when I got to this one mailbox near the very end of my route. It was a Poland gravel driveway, with large open fields on both sides of the roads, surrounded by lots of wilderness. It was eerie, to say the least. You could never see the houses because the driveway extended a little ways up a hill and down it, and it was a pretty dead road overall that I drove on. Like I said, I always used to get the creeps getting out of my truck and dropping off the mail. I would always feel like I was being watched closely. It bothered me. It wasn't even 2 weeks into my route that I had my first experience. I remember this day, and I remember the air felt different, like there was going to be a thunderstorm approaching. You could feel the humidity and moisture in the air, more so than normal, because again, this is Oklahoma. I remember getting out of my truck to walk to the mailbox to drop the mail off when I sensed something off to my right. I look over, and not even 100 feet away from me, in the middle of the field, is the largest animal I've ever seen. I thought it was a lion at first, due to its sheer size and what appeared to be a mane-like clump of fur around its head. But as I looked longer, I noticed it had very canine-like features. It wasn't doing anything ominous, though, just sitting there like a dog would casually, but it was staring right in my direction. I've never seen such intensity in a stare like that before. Fear struck me hard in that moment, and I did not feel safe. I dropped off the mail and sped my way out of the area to my next location. Being the distance I was from the thing, it was hard to accurately judge details, but enough that I could tell you it was not a bear. It looked very dog-like in the head, the ears, the face, and the overall body shape. It wasn't bulky and round like a bear normally is. It was much more skinny. I continued to work that route for another month, but never saw this large black lion dog thing again. I then got assigned a new route, and someone was taking over mine. I had the new route actually till I broke my hip and quit. Anyway, take it what you will. That is what I saw. I've got what I believe to be a Dogman encounter that happened to me and my girlfriend back in 2017. We were in Pryor Creek, Oklahoma, for just a few days. We arrived on a Thursday and weren't leaving till that Sunday since we were there for a wedding, which was Saturday. We wanted to use the rest of Thursday and all of Friday to explore the area and see cool stuff since we had time. Pryor Creek is a small town. I'm talking like 10,000 people or less in the entire city. On Friday, me and my girlfriend decided to go and check out the Pryor Creek Nature Trail that's in the area. We were hungry for some outside hiking and adventure, and a nature trail just seemed like the perfect way to go. It's 3+ miles of long back trail that has a river running parallel with it. It was about 9 in the morning when we went. We were talking when we came up to a part in the trail where my girlfriend pointed out and motioned for me to look. We saw a black, wolf-like animal, hunched down, drinking from the river. It was extremely large. My girlfriend began hyperventilating. After a couple of seconds of staring at it through the trees, it looked up and noticed us. It was only about 50 or so feet away by the creek bed. It was incredibly massive and had a large wolf head. It then stood up on 2 feet, and my girlfriend and I ran away screaming back to the car. I didn't know it at the time, but I guess it was called a Dogman, but I just thought it was a real-life werewolf. I just didn't imagine them being so incredibly large. I never really thought about these creatures really ever existing. I remember afterwards we were trying to research it and see if other people had seen werewolves too, and based on our descriptions, it turns out that many others are seeing a similar type of creature, dubbed the Dogman. I don't know too much about these animals besides what I experienced, but I know I never want to be anywhere close to those things again. This occurred in June of 2016. I had just gone through a really rocky breakup with my girlfriend of 8 years, and so I wanted to get away for a while. One of my close friends has a really nice log cabin out in the middle of nowhere, just outside of Colorado Springs. I had asked permission if it was okay if I could stay there for a couple of weeks just to clear my head, and of course he was totally cool with that. I even remember going to pick up the key from him, and him boasting about how peaceful and wonderful that entire cabin is. I had never been to it myself, but I know him and his parents had visited several times during our childhood that I was aware of. This cabin also is said to have a really nice pond near it with lots of wildlife, with deer and all sorts of other animals. In fact, I know his father has hunted up there multiple times because he's brought back quite a bit of deer meat that he made into backstraps, sausage, jerky, etc. And a lot of it was actually given to me. Anyway, I'm rambling. Sorry, I just wanted to set up the story for you. Because long story short, I end up going up there the next day or so, and it is as peaceful as ever. But something happened to me that I can't quite explain. Of course, no man ever steps foot into the wild, whether you are experienced or not, without a sophisticated weapon. I chose a 12-gauge shotgun. It might not have been the best choice, but I figured it was enough to deter anything that could potentially be dangerous to me, or so I thought. I didn't expect to experience any real danger while I'm up here, so maybe I chose too lightly. I got situated in the cabin and just enjoyed the silence, the solitude, and the beautiful view. Night fell rather quickly, and I remember the sounds of the forest and nature outside being so strong at night. You could just sit next to the window and hear the crickets singing in chorus. It was beautiful. I fell asleep after doing some reading on the couch, and I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My hairs were standing up, and I felt really uneasy, like something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. It was the strangest feeling. It took me a couple seconds, but I realized the noises outside had quieted. It was pretty dark out, and there must have been cloud coverage, because I couldn't see anything much when I looked out the window. Boy, I could feel it though. Something wasn't right. I was finishing that very thought, and I could hear something very heavy walking outside along the side of the cabin. It didn't sound like a typical animal. The footsteps sounded strange, like someone walking on two legs. Then it stopped outside the cabin at some point, and it sounded like somebody was trying to break in. So I ran to grab my shotgun that I placed in the bedroom. I sat there on the bedroom floor with the gun in my hand, ready for anything, and it just got quiet again. I sat there in silence for a few moments, and then began to hear what I can only describe as a deep scratching on the front door. My heart was literally beating out of my chest. I was sweating bullets. I was convinced some super huge beefed out mass murderer was going to take me out and was just messing with me, carving things in the front door with his huge elephant knife. I was ready for war, and my gun was aimed directly at the door. But just as soon as it began, it ended. I sat there, still on edge, with the gun pointed at the doorway, for another hour, maybe more. I can only guess that that's what it was because I really had no concept of time. Things were still really quiet outside. After exhaustion of just sitting there with a gun, I must have fallen asleep, because I remember I woke up to daylight. Realizing what had transpired the night before, I wanted to run outside to see if there were any signs or footprints that I could make out. I figured if I can find footprints, then maybe those footprints would lead me to where this person came from. As I took a step outside the cabin, I practically gasped at the deepest, most grueling-looking claw marks I'd ever seen. It looked as if a bear had gone to town on the front door, tearing deep marks that were about 4 feet long in the door. Something with an immense power had to do this. Luckily for me, the ground was a little bit wet and mushy, and it was still fairly dry and clear outside, so there's no way I wouldn't be able to find any footprints, or so I hoped. Because of where the front door was, and how there's just concrete there were obviously no signs of any footprints or anything that looked out of the ordinary. But, walking around to the side of the cabin, I did discover what I can only describe as large dog prints in the mud that led along the side of the cabin. This confused me even more because I thought either the psycho murderer had a large dog with him, or it was some large dog that was trying to get into the house. I wasn't quite convinced, and so I decided to continue to hold my ground and not let anyone or anything scare me away from my much needed alone time. The next few nights were pretty calm and uneventful. Nothing really out of the ordinary happened. After days went on, I began to forget about the whole thing, and if I did think about it, I would just brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the severe stress due to the breakup. I know stress can do a lot to the brain, and so then I thought I made it all up. I think it was the 4th night, maybe the 5th night, is when I left. It was about sundown, and I was sitting there on the couch reading, and I could hear very clearly what sounded like something really large running through the woods towards the cabin at a great speed. The best way I can describe it is like this rumbling sound that basically sounds like an animal running, and it kept getting closer and closer, and then all of a sudden, BAM! The entire cabin shook with such force, like somebody had just driven a car into it. It about scared me so bad I flew off the couch. As I'm trying to regain my composure and get up, my eyes go directly towards the nearest window, where the most evil-looking dog face was staring down at me. Bright red eyes, huge teeth, and what I could only explain as a grin on this thing's face. I started screaming. I had never seen a dog that looked like that before, and I've never had a dog grin at me. These windows were about 8 or so feet off the ground, and this thing's head filled up the entire window, looking down right at me. I ran back to the bedroom to get my shotgun, and I waited again in the bedroom for this thing to break in and try to get me. I waited again with nothing happening. At some point or another, I thought up a great plan in my head instead of being stuck in that bedroom with this thing outside the house. I would run to my car outside as fast as I could and pull away. It was my only chance for escape, and I didn't want to be torn apart by this hideous-looking animal. It took me what felt like hours just to muster up the courage to do this, but in reality it was probably only maybe 20 minutes. Just like a runner, I crouched, counted till 3, and sprinted as fast as I could, gun in hand to the door, and then to the car. I'm surprised I didn't fumble my keys like in every single Hollywood movie, but the stars were aligned for me in that moment. Keys went in, I flew in the car and locked all the doors and windows, and I started that baby up fast. As soon as I put my car in reverse, I looked up and my jaw dropped. Standing 30 feet away, fully exposed in the bathed light of my headlights, was this weird-looking shaped animal of what I can only describe as an ugly-looking dog that was upright. It was gray, had hocks like a dog, and had a weird-shaped back. It looked similar to that of a hyena body, but standing up. It lifted its hands up, just like a person would, to cover its face from the brightness of my headlights. I did have my brights on, so I might have blinded it partially. I don't know if it was the autopilot in me, but I slammed on the reverse so hard and flew down that driveway to the main road, using my side mirrors to watch where I was going. This thing never followed me, to my knowledge, and after I saw it, I refused to look up and look at it more. It was a good 3-hour drive from this gravel road I had pulled onto to my friend's house, and it was late, but I didn't care. In fact, I probably ruined my tires going down the gravel roads so fast, but again, I didn't care. I floored it and ended up shaving 30 or so minutes off my driving time because I went faster than I should have. I remember banging on my friend's door and me pushing my way in once he opened the door. I was in such a state of panic and frantic. He didn't care though, and he was pissed off about me banging on his door in the wee hours of the night, and he saw that I was freaking out. I was talking so fast and I told him what I saw. I don't really think he wanted to hear it though. He kinda just basically told me to shut up and to sleep on his couch if I needed to, and that we'll talk about it in the morning. I felt bad and I profusely thanked him, but with everything that happened, I only got a few hours of sleep that night. In fact, this traumatized me so much that I had entirely forgotten about the breakup in that wee bit of time. Anyway, to make a long story short, in the morning he was a little bit more sensible, and I was able to tell him fully what had happened. And all he said was that sometimes his dad talked about seeing weird animals out by the cabin when he was hunting, but he never went into detail. I'm sorry this was such a long story, but there was a lot of parts to it. I've never been a believer in anything other than what we see, but my guess is areas like big forests, mountains, rivers, jungles, etc., there might be animals we haven't yet seen. As terrified as I was, I've now learned I don't want anything to do with going out in the woods by myself anymore. I'm not quite sure what it is, but my husband and I have been seeing this large dog creature walking around the back side of our property, stealing our chickens and goats. My husband has shot at them multiple times, and that they always seem to make the situation even worse. We've since stopped having chickens at this property and are preparing to leave and move. We started seeing these things at the beginning of the summertime, back in early July. I've heard there's a lot of Bigfoot around in this area, so when we first saw them at a distance, I had just assumed it was one of them. These things, though, they didn't look like a typical Bigfoot. They looked like giant black wolves that walked on two legs just like a person. We weren't sure what to make of it at all. It wasn't long after before we started noticing our livestock disappearing, little bit by little bit. Come to find out, our chickens were either missing or slaughtered entirely. Sometimes we would find our goats with their throats ripped out, or ripped and shredded. It got to the point to where in early September, these things had come in and taken all of our livestock. We started off with 24 chickens and 7 goats, and now we have nothing. My husband has tried to stop them by shooting at them, but it seems to only make them angry. They've attacked the house before and have tried to get in. In fact, there has been weekends and times during the week that we've had to leave the house for a few days in hopes that the activity will die down and maybe we'll be safe. Oftentimes, when we return, a more significant amount of livestock are gone. We also had a few cats and dogs along with our chickens and goats, and they were some of the first to disappear. There's a lot of woods out back behind our property, and my husband and I are far too scared to even venture forth back there in fear that we don't have the proper firepower to deal with these things. Wish us luck. This was back in August of 2008 when I was visiting my girlfriend late at night. She lived out of town a little ways and not too far from a larger cemetery. This cemetery was very old, and I want to say it was at least 100 to 150 years old. Probably because I know there were some Civil War era graves, if I remember correctly. I'm mentioning this cemetery because even though we did go on a date there once, I had a strange sensation in the area around us. I actually did experience something there, and I can't quite come up with an explanation for it. Let me talk about the date first. Months back, we had went and hung out in the graveyard and even did an EV session, but that's besides the point. Her and I loved exploring and doing stuff, and so it was her idea to go and spend the evening in the cemetery, just because it's fun and spooky, and it's interesting to go and look at old gravestones and talk to ghosts, apparently. The whole time we were in there, we both felt like we were being watched, and it felt really uneasy. We both brushed it off as it's just the idea of a cemetery being spooky, so we dropped it and did our EV session anyway, and hung out. But of course, with the EV session, nothing really interesting happened. No communication, nothing. Like I said, it's just a creepy-ass place overall. Pretty sure the date happened around sometime in late May. Fast forward to August, and like I said, I was driving to go see her, and it was nighttime. As I'm pulling up by the cemetery, my eyes catch these 2 glowing yellow eyes from just a little ways into the gate. Upon my first glance, I noticed that these eyes were attached to a huge mass that I couldn't really make out a whole lot of detail. Initially, I panicked and slowed the car down to immediately get a better look. And as my eyes adjusted to the low light, I could see this thing looked like a Hollywood werewolf. I freaked out, but part of me tried to convince myself that this was just some prop, or somebody in a costume waiting to prank someone. But it was watching me. It had followed my car as I slowly drove by looking at it. It freaked me the hell out, and by the time I got to my girlfriend's, I told her all about what I saw. She was more intrigued than scared, and wanted to do some homework and see what she could dig up. Fast forward another week or so, and I've kind of pushed the memory out of my memory bank. She calls me up and tells me that she's been doing a lot of research in the past week, since she is a paranormal buff, and found out that what I saw is probably a Dogman. She came to that conclusion because apparently there's an Indian burial mound close by, or at least used to be, until the area was deemed a residential zone back in the 50s and had houses and other stuff built onto it, like neighborhoods, commercial zones, businesses, etc. She said it actually looks like the cemetery itself could have possibly been built on part of that area that the burial mound was originally on, but she said she couldn't find a conclusive answer. She told me more. Back in the 80s, I guess there was a huge problem with satanic worship in that same cemetery. Huge problems with dogs and cats going missing in the neighborhood. Graves being dug up and bodies being defiled with missing cadavers, along with various other black magic rituals that apparently took place. I took it with a grain of salt because I'm personally not too sure about that. The only other weird thing that stuck out to me is that she said apparently there's been Wendigo sightings in that area for the past 20 or so years. I had no idea what a Wendigo was until she told me it was this kind of tall skeletal thing from what she gathered. Anyway, I guess what I saw in that cemetery is a Dogman. This happened back in 1997 in the springtime. I was in college at the time, driving around somewhere in town later at night. I guess probably the scariest part of the whole story is the fact that I was in town when I saw this animal. Something I suspected you would only see if you were out far, deep into the wilderness, but I guess that's not the case. The road I was on was fairly busy during the day, but did have sections of road where there were no houses or even commercial zoning around, which was a part of the road I was on at the time of this encounter. I was driving back alone in my '93 Honda Accord when I came to an area of road where I saw this large black animal walking alongside the road. My first thought was that somebody had maybe lost a horse or something because this animal was just so large, but as my headlights illuminated more and I got closer, I could clearly see this was not a horse at all. It was not a cow, and it did not have the distinctive shape that a bear does. It was much more lanky and defined, if that makes any sense. It was very dog-like, and it never once turned its head to look over at me. It was walking alongside of the road, heading the direction, and I was never paid attention to. It's like I didn't exist to this thing. As I saw it and thought to myself, what the hell is that? I slowed way down to try to get a better look at it, but as I got closer, that's when I noticed what looked like scabs and mange all over its body with large missing patches of fur. That's when I noticed its head and face just a little bit more, and I chalked it up to being a really deformed coyote, except I'm pretty sure coyotes don't get anywhere near that size. This thing was a massive, massive animal. The best way I can describe it to you from what I saw was a really big, mangy, coyote-looking dog. It didn't quite look like a coyote, but it didn't quite look like a regular dog. I've never seen anything like it. It looked like it had patches of fur missing and scabs all over its skin. Its skin was really dark and had way too many teeth for its mouth. They looked like Swiss Army knives. They were so incredibly sharp. Even I was able to notice how defined and sharp they were from as far away as I was. This animal had to have been close to the size of a horse, just in sheer size alone. I honestly, like I said, thought it was a deformed bear or a dog. It looked so bizarre, I couldn't quite make out exactly what it was, other than it having very distinctive canine features that personally stood out. I didn't get a good look at the eyes as I was driving, and I only had a few seconds to really take in everything that I saw. The snout, though, the snout definitely stood out to me, and along with the ears and the teeth, of course. It did scare me, but I was more intrigued than anything else, really. I tried to do a little digging and to see if I can find anything on it, but everything I looked up just pointed to a mangy coyote, or even the chupacabra that looks kind of similar to what I saw, but not near the size that I did. I've only told a few people about what I saw, and surprisingly, they don't believe me. Especially when I tell them the size. Gosh, it was so huge, and I think that's what startled me the most. I decided to keep researching, and that brought me to the topic of Dogman. This happened to me on the East Coast, and I've only researched just a little bit on the topic. But all that nonsense seems to point to the Midwest. I don't know if I believe something like that, considering even Bigfoot to me is laughable at best, but I still can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was just a really big deformed manged bear, and my imagination is turning it into something that it isn't. I've ran it through my head so many times, and I just can't think of a single animal that even looks remotely like that in the Pennsylvania area. I live a little ways out of town, actually in a really small little single-wide trailer. I don't have a whole lot around me, and just a few neighbors scattered throughout. The neighborhood I live on is definitely spread out, so to speak. I have a small yard in front of my house with a big maple tree that hangs over my front yard, as well as the driveway. The small road that connects to the front of my house is a pretty untraversed road for the most part. Not a whole lot of traffic day or night. Beyond that is a large open field. I would say probably a few acres worth of just undeveloped land that's sat there for quite a while. Beyond that is just wilderness and more undeveloped land. As of lately, I've been having some really terrifying experiences where I live. The first time I experienced this was just a few months ago when, out of my window, I see this tall, upright figure running towards my house. Terrified, I locked and closed my windows, made sure my doors were locked, and called the police. Then, to my horror, as I'm on the phone with the operator, the door handle starts to jiggle violently. I remain as calm as I can, thinking someone's trying to break in. Police arrive within 5 minutes, and of course they can't find a trace of anything. Although I wasn't quite sure how to explain to them that I saw this tall, upright figure with pointed ears. Anyway, fast forward a couple days, and I see this figure wandering around my house again. Terrified, instead of calling the police, I hunker down in my bedroom, hoping they would just go away. This, what I thought at the time was a person, begins jiggling my door handle harder and harder again, trying to get into the house, banging on the door and banging on the side of the house. This person paced all around for hours and hours. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure why I didn't feel like calling the police this time was necessary, but that probably was my biggest mistake. A few days go by and nothing happens. In fact, I think a whole few weeks went by without anything happening. And then again, I see this figure come up from the field again, and I get a much better look at it, since there's a street light not too far down the road that illuminates most of the road at nighttime. And what I saw horrifies me. This black shape, I guess I would call it, shaped like a person, looks like a person, but is much taller, and I could tell had a dog-like head and pointed ears. The only thing I could make sense out of it was maybe I was looking at a werewolf or something. I don't know. I didn't hear any sounds or see any sights, but I definitely saw the outline of this thing once again run towards my house. Without wasting a second, I called the police department and had them send another officer over to investigate the situation. Of course, they only got there in about 5 to 10 minutes and this thing disappeared. At this point, I began getting threats saying that I was making false claims, and so I was told that if I called about this issue again, detained and charged with a crime. At this point, I kinda knew the police weren't going to do anything, so I continued to wait and wait until this thing came again so I can get a better look at it. I don't really own any guns or any other heavy amounts of firepower, but I do have a baseball bat and some bear spray, so I should be ready in case this thing does break in. I really have no idea what I'm going up against, but I will admit I am scared shitless, especially knowing the police are virtually powerless to me in this situation to help. I've also inquired other neighbors about seeing a similar thing, but No one has really mentioned anything like I'm describing. I try to watch the field at night or in the dusk time because that's when it seems to become most active. But again, I don't see anything usually. It only happens late at night, around midnight, until something happens. I don't always see it, but the few times I have, I just happened to catch it as it was running towards my house. I don't know if this is a literal werewolf, or if this is just a person in a costume, or what's going on. It hasn't happened for a few weeks, but like I said, it's been happening on and off for the past few months. It's always the same pattern. This thing will come up to my house, rattle the door handle heavily, bang on the door, bang on the house, pace around the house for a while, and then vanish like nothing ever happened. I'm currently 29, and this happened to me back when I was an early teenager. I lived alone with my father in a more secluded area that had a lot of woods and forests behind us. Because we kind of lived in a smaller house, we were on the outskirts of town, and a wood stove was our primary source of heating. I spent a lot of my falls and winters splitting wood outside in a clearing in the back side of our property. There was this really old, cool stump that I always used to split my wood on. My father would go and fell a bunch of old dead trees and cut them up for me. Then it was my job to split all the rounds and then stack them. I did this for many, many years, but this isn't what my story is about. I just like to start off with my story that I do believe in the paranormal and things that can't be explained, and to this day, I'm not quite sure what was watching me. The first time I remember seeing it was when I was splitting wood, and I got that feeling I was being watched. Checking my surroundings, I quickly noticed that peering out of the woods about 100 or so feet away was this large wolf-like creature that would just watch me. I'm not sure if it was curious or planning anything malicious, but it just kind of sat there, still as a statue, and watched me as I split rounds and rounds of wood. I would keep periodically checking to see if it had moved closer to me or had disappeared, and it would just stay in that one spot for hours. This thing never moved a muscle. I'm not quite sure if it knew that I could see it, because even though it was hidden behind trees, it was visible enough to me that I could make out it was a rather large wolf-like animal. It scared me at first, but after this kept occurring and this thing was just watching me, I realized it probably wasn't going to do anything since it had not yet. Sometimes I wonder if it would have came closer had I not had a big splitting maul, but I'm not too sure. The other odd thing is that as this went on over the years, it always appeared in the same spot and stayed as still as possible for hours on end. I would be lying if I said there weren't days where my dad made me go out there and split wood that I was not incredibly nervous. I wasn't quite sure that this thing was standing on two legs or what, because all I would see is this massive body and this huge wolf head watching me from afar. It looked fairly shaggy and maybe more coyote looking, and the fur color on the face from what I remember. I really don't know why this creature would be in the area other than we had a really high deer population at the time. I'm no expert and I don't know what those things eat, but I would like to think I do assume that it did eat the deer, if that makes any sense, since it probably was a predator. For the longest time, I had convinced myself that this was just waiting for the right moment to attack me, but in all those years of waiting and splitting wood, it never did. I never did tell my father about what I saw because he is such a hard-ass, a no-nonsense type of individual. I knew he would have just blown me off as being crazy or trying to get out of work and being lazy. I do wonder, though, from time to time if he ever experienced the same experience I did, if he was ever out there felling trees or even cutting up old dead ones. I probably should have asked him before he passed away. All of this mainly occurred in the fall and winter, just about every single year from the time I started splitting the wood. I want to say about 12 years old. This lasted up until I was 16 when we moved houses, and I no longer lived there. It also makes me wonder why I never really saw this thing in the spring and summertime, but I don't recall ever really going out and looking for this thing either way. It just kind of showed up whenever it did and watched me for however long it wanted to watch me for. I know one thing was definitely for certain. Out of all the times that I knew this thing was around me, watching me, there was never a moment that I felt like I could have comfortably let my guard down in fear of this thing waiting for the moment to strike. Maybe, just maybe, it never quite found the right moment. Back in 2004, I worked in a very small hospital in a very tiny town. This hospital was pretty limited in its services, and even the ER was fairly tiny. Usually, if there was anything serious that we couldn't provide patients, which looking back was quite a number of things, it wasn't uncommon for patients to be life-flighted to other hospitals. Because we were such a small hospital and so short-staffed, our security staff that I was a part of was also pretty small too. It was just me and this one other guy named Earl, who I always remember was this older, funny fella. He was my superior on the job and showed me the ropes when I first got hired. There wasn't really a whole lot to learn, fortunately enough. This hospital is just a few blocks outside of a neighborhood with a lot of undeveloped land all around, and a decent-sized parking lot. We didn't see tremendous amounts of foot traffic, but we did get people coming in and out often enough. I luckily never had to kick anyone out or had to deal with any unruly individuals in my time, but I did have some unexplained encounters with an animal that I know nothing about. My first day working nights, Earl told me that sometimes people would see this really large black dog walking around the parking lot, pacing. It would terrify staff, patients, and other people who were coming and going. I thought he was just messing with me for the longest time until about 2 weeks into the job, I saw it for myself. I was outside having a cigarette, and it was probably about 2 a.m. when I looked over to my left and saw this large animal walking around the eastern part of the parking lot. I thought to myself, what the fuck? I had never seen a dog so large before. Upon realizing it was the same animal that Earl had talked about seeing, I radioed him and asked him what the protocol was for that. He told me nothing, that animal control and police had already been called multiple times and there was nothing they could do. I'm not quite sure how that's the case, but that's just what I was told, so I wasn't going to argue with my superior. Anyway, since I couldn't really dispute it, I just had to do my best to ignore it and go back inside. The weirdest thing is that this animal was never seen during the day. I only ever heard about it from the night staff, and me seeing it several times out in the parking lot. People would often come in and ask about why there was such a huge loose dog in the parking lot. And there would also be times that staff would come inside and be white as a ghost, saying that this thing charged at them. Suffice to say that it sounds like people just kind of learned to live with it around here and to ignore it. It didn't come out every single night either. There would be periods of days, if not weeks, that nobody would see it, and then just like that it would reappear again, the same as it disappearing. Sometimes it would only be walking around for maybe an hour if not less, while other times it seemed to pace around all night long, and you could see it go in and out of the cameras. But always it would be gone by sunrise. There is one other particular night that really stands out. A man had run into the ER in a panic, telling us that this large dog attacked his car and he fled into the nearest building, which was of course us. He described it the same way everyone else describes the same animal that we all see. So of course, being the only one on shift at that night, I had to go investigate. His vehicle was out on the far side of the parking lot, near the entrance, and besides a few scratch marks and a couple of dents, I didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. Whatever attacked his car, though, didn't stop after he fled, apparently. As creepy as it was, it just weirded me out and made me not want to be outside the rest of my job. I'm not saying this is a hellhound, and I'm not saying this is a ghost. I'm not saying this is even an alien. But what I can say is this is definitely some unknown animal, and I'm not quite sure what to make of the whole thing. I just try and follow Earl's best advice I can to this day. If you see it, just leave it be. I had an encounter with a real-life werewolf just a few weeks back. I'm terrible at taking down my stuff for the wintertime, and so I had left my pool up and a bunch of other junk in my backyard that I've been really needing to take down now for quite a while. Just a few weeks back, I finally decided that I'd go out there and stick it in my shop. I go out there with a flashlight since it gets dark out early, and I start to undo my pool. Real quick though, before I tell you what happens next. My backyard is huge. It's basically just an open field that spans across the land and goes off into state game land. At this time of year, a lot of it is covered in dead leaves that have fallen from the nearby trees. Getting up in the morning and looking out makes for an absolutely beautiful scenery. There's a lot of open area around with big locust trees scattered throughout and various other trees. We get a lot of deer wandering around this area too. Mostly does, but I have seen the occasional buck wander through here over the years. Most of the time though, they're just little 2-pointers and not quite ready. So I'm out there taking the legs off my big Intex pool, and I start to hear the crunching of leaves just about 30 feet away from me. I shone my flashlight over where I heard the crunch, and I almost pooped in my pants where I stood. It was like the Hulk from the comics, but wearing a werewolf costume. This thing was massive, glowing amber eyes, huge teeth, a massive Conan the Barbarian chest with muscles rippling underneath its fur. I could only bear to look at it for a few seconds before I turned around and sprinted into my house. I locked every door and turned off the lights. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I had no idea what the hell I just saw. My uncle has had encounters with Bigfoots years back, and maybe I can get him to send you the story so I know that creatures beyond our understanding exist. I never heard any sounds or anything weird after that sighting. I continued to leave all the lights off and everything locked for hours afterwards. The next morning, I sure as hell took advantage of the daylight, made sure there was nothing around where I was, and I got that pool taken down and put into my shop ASAP. I couldn't find any tracks or potential traces of anything there the night before. What I saw scared me pantsless. I feel like since time has gone on, I've been able to make sense of it all a little bit better than I did before. I didn't sleep well for the first couple of nights, just trying to convince myself it was real. I wasn't sure who I can tell, but I knew I had to talk to somebody about what I'd seen. I called my uncle to talk to him about it, and he believes me, since I know he shared with me his Bigfoot encounters. In fact, he knows more about this stuff than I, and told me this animal was probably in the area because of all the food and deer that's around. I also forgot to mention a little bit beyond my backyard drops down quite a ways to a mini canyon with a creek running through it. So I guess my area happens to be the perfect hunting ground. You got coverage, food, and water, and no one to really bother you. I just hope it doesn't show its face again. I saw a bizarre-looking creature on my way home from a long business trip in the fall of 2013. I remember the details pretty vividly, and I feel partially traumatized by the whole event. I was driving southbound on the 103 that leads down from Michigan into Indiana. Right near the border is a small river that runs perpendicular to the road called Pigeon River. It's not a big river by any means, but it is right near the border. It was pretty late at night at the time. I want to say around midnight, maybe just a little later. I didn't really see any other traffic on the road at the time of the incident. And yes, I pulled up to the bridge and I see this massive Dogman stop halfway out onto the road. I only say Dogman because that's the only way I know how to describe what I saw. It was really hairy and shaggy and stood probably about 8 feet tall. It was huge. It looked like a man and a dog mixed together. Its head was reminiscent of a German Shepherd and had yellow glowing eyes and long claws on its hands. I saw it take one step into the road, turned and faced my car directly. I remember distinctly my jaw dropping in shock at the sight of what I was looking at. The look on this thing's face was like a deer in the headlights. It must have been surprised that I saw it because within half a second it disappeared quickly into the woods behind it, retreating back into the coverage. It all happened so fast it took me a long time to fully process what had happened. I think I was in such shock when I saw it that I don't even remember slowing down. It just looked over at me and then disappeared. I'd even told myself I just hallucinated the whole thing, trying to convince myself what I saw wasn't real. But it was. It was quite unnerving to say the least, and made me extremely uncomfortable the rest of the drive home. I had the shakes really bad afterwards, and couldn't really get good sleep the night after, even getting home just a few hours later. I guess what I saw was a monster, and now I know that they really do exist. I couldn't imagine being the poor soul whose car broke down right there by that bridge where I saw it. I felt like this thing was going to follow me home and get me. I shared my experience with a few close friends of mine who are into weird stuff like paranormal and things like that. And my one friend tells me that there's a lot of weirder similar sightings around that same area, in the whole Michigan Greater Peninsula area, I guess. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I saw because I'm sure some would consider it a werewolf, but I don't think that's what it was. I'm not really sure why it saw my car and then stepped back into the woods. I don't know if maybe it was trying to get somewhere and I startled it. It's almost as if it didn't want to be seen and was trying to really quickly conceal itself. It all just makes sense about the whole experience, I guess, if you think about it, but I'm still uneasy, to say the least. Anyway, this was my experience that I'm running into you, and I want you to know it really happened for me. And it's also been hard for me too, because people are so quick to write you off as crazy. I generally don't like to share my experiences, especially this one, but I feel like it'll be worth it, and hopefully, just hopefully, your listeners will be receptive. Thank you for your time. I didn't see anything, but I wanted to share this with you because it happened with me and my cousin. Okay, so a little pre-information about me. I'm pretty close with my cousin who moved to Idaho and has several hundred acres. Eastern Idaho to be exact. My cousin is an outdoor fiend and uses all the land he has to hunt on, as much as he can. He's pretty lucky too because he gets a lot of deer, elk, and other good game all over his land. Plus, there's tons of access to old logging roads and huge clearings where they came in and cut down a bunch of trees. It's pretty fantastic to say the least. He's gone through with me and we've set up so many tree stands in that whole area and scouted and have hiked and have had just great times together. Now, usually when I go and visit him, I'll stay for a couple of weeks at a time. I haven't gone and stayed with him in a few years, and so this happened just a few years ago during the fall when I went and visited him. He wanted to take me out one morning to go scout out some good places to put up a couple tree stands and just do some good old-fashioned exploring in the woods. We hopped in a small pickup truck and we drove around the backwoods areas to see if we couldn't find any good areas to dig around in. We came across a rather large clearing that had been cleared out by loggers years and years ago. My cousin always brings binoculars with him, because sometimes you could see if there's game in the area or nearby. Before setting up tree stands, he likes to see if there's been any recent signs or activity of potential deer and elk in the area. We get to this clearing and he pulls out his binoculars and scouts around the area to see if we can spot anything. We had already been thinking about putting up a stand in a couple of trees near us, so it was a good day already. Lots of wind coming our direction, so we didn't have to worry about anything picking up our scent. My cousin got up in the bed of his truck and began looking around. He started getting excited when he spotted some does and a big buck scouting out the area a little more. He froze and his entire demeanor changed from excitement to panic. I'm standing there looking right at his face and his expression was just wrong. I immediately panicked and thought bear with a cub is nearby. He interrupted that thought with the, "What in the hell am I looking at?" followed by a "Whoa!" just a few short seconds later. He pulls the binoculars down quickly and squints his eyes in the direction he was just looking. He then throws the binoculars back up and his jaw is agape, looking at whatever he's looking at. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out and wanting to know what the hell's going on. He doesn't say anything and continues to just watch, and then quickly jumps out of the bed of his truck and tells me we need to leave right now. Still thinking it was a mama bear and her cub, I didn't even question it, and we left. We hauled ass back out to his place. He doesn't speak a word the entire time, and he really seemed bothered. This wasn't him. He had been in dangerous situations, but never acted like this. He even told me a time he stumbled out into the darkness and was only 20 feet away from a mountain lion. That is so close to death, and even then he wasn't afraid. Anyway, we get back to his house, and I finally get him to tell me what happened back there, and I wanted to know if it was a bear like I thought it was. He simply explained it to me that he saw something he's never seen before. A freaky-looking timber wolf the size of a moose shot out of the woods onto the buck and tore this animal into pieces. I was confused and shocked, but what he told me had to have been the truth. The look on his face told me he was terrified. He was trembling the entire time. He said this wolf tore that buck to pieces in just seconds, and he knew that wolves did not get that big. I believe him, and whatever he saw really bothered him, like I said. The rest of the trip, we never went back out exploring, and I'm not sure if he's ever ventured out to that clearing again, but it really got to him. Anyway, I thought this would be a great thing to share to you. I decided to reach out finally after seeing something that I can't begin to describe. I've lived in Virginia for almost 3 years now and started a graveyard shift job at a gigantic complex which includes original houses from the 1800 colonial period. For those who live here, they will be able to identify the exact location in which I'm referring to. I've worked here going on a year and a half now. I monitor every building and repair any HVAC equipment during the night. Thinking back to my first weird job experience, it was when I first started doing the graveyard shift. I heard an unidentifiable noise my second month here at around 4 in the morning. I don't scare easily, and I'm a bit of a horror movie buff. It was a very low growl. It sounded as if it was crouching right behind me in my office. I sat there, stunned, not turning around, not moving whatsoever. When I got the courage to turn and see what it could be, there was nothing there. I tried to talk to my coworkers about the noise, but since I'm a young guy that does a bit of pranking, no one really takes me too seriously. Trust me when I say, I question so much and pick apart horror movies as a hobby, so when I couldn't identify this sound, I blamed it on the refrigerator I have in here. It's been well over a year now, and I've never once heard that noise again. Recently, I've been leaving early to take the scenic route to get to work, enjoying the fall foliage and the cool breeze. I've been pulling into the same spot for the past couple of weeks to smoke cigarettes and relax before getting there and clocking in. Last week, when I pulled in and parked, I felt this uneasy feeling of being watched by something or someone in the tree line. I brushed it off for the first 2 or 3 times it happened during the rest of the week. Now, this may seem like paranoia, but I know paranoia being a recovering coke addict. I could promise you, this isn't some delusion. This is a trust your gut type of paranoia. 3 days ago, I went back to flash some headlights and try to establish some dominance to take back my spot and get nosy, hoping to see if something or anything at all. When I didn't see anything, I shrugged it off once again and decided to park anyway. No sinking feeling, I started to relax. I put the cigarette between my lips, cracked my window down about 8 inches, put my car in park, and pulled out my lighter. As I hit my lighter and leaned in to light the cigarette, I get a cool sensation covering my entire body. The hair on the back of my neck stands up. As I look around the car, I peer into the rearview mirror and see some white shape about 50 feet from the back end of the car. I tap the brake to illuminate the area and see a gangly, tall creature with a long white face standing on its back legs, hunched over 5 or 6 feet into the tree line, about 20 feet right behind my car. I took a shaped breath in and about coughed up a lung when I threw my car into drive and sped off. This was only a few days ago. I work by myself on the second floor of a pretty secure building. I keep hearing crunching leaves as if a grown man is walking directly under the window where my office is. This only happens while I'm at work, but I feel it'll be a matter of time until I feel its presence at my house as well. The more I read and try to understand what I saw, I couldn't be more convinced that what I saw was a Wendigo. I'm starting to dream of this thing. Last night was the first night it appeared in a dream. Being in Virginia by myself gives me much relief to my family, and knowing that they aren't in danger. Even if I am in danger. Sure as hell feels like I am. First things first. This happened to me when I was around 10. I've lived in Idaho all my life and spent a lot of time outside, or in the wilderness as a kid. My grandparents would take me camping, and my older brother and I would always hike up whatever trails we could find to get a view of the sunset. On one of these occasions, something terrifying happened. We were up at a campsite I only know as Warm River. The river there never freezes over, and my brother and I were on a regular evening hike. There was an old tunnel bored through the mountain at one part of the trail, probably an old train tunnel, and we were walking through it when I heard something I'll never forget. After walking through probably 2/3 of the way through this tunnel, I heard a terrible screech at the end we entered through. The screech wasn't like anything I've heard before. I've heard the screams of animals on dark and windy nights. I even think I've heard Bigfoot calls a few times, but never the metallic grinding screech that I heard that day. The point is, whatever the sound was, it did not sound natural in any capacity. I probably jumped 5 feet in the air when I heard it, and my brother shouted a few choice curse words before shooing me quickly to the exit of the tunnel. At this point, my brother decided that we should just continue walking and head back after whatever made that noise and hopefully cleared out. We did not have any firearms on us, so I was pretty upset. My brother reassured me we would be fine, and we made the walk back without any incident. However, I did not get any sleep that night. Whether it was the thing that screeched at us or just my imagination, I heard things moving around the campsite the entire night, as well as whispers echoing through the darkness just outside the trailer. I woke my brother up a few times to check out what it was, but he refused each time, telling me that it was probably just other campers staying up late and enjoying themselves. The rest of the trip was pretty normal. We packed up the following day, and my life continued as normal. I simply chalked up what had happened as a harmless event that I must have been exaggerating in retrospect. A few weeks later, I went up to Pine Basin, an old ski lodge my family rented each year for family reunions. Here, I would mess around with my cousins, our favorite activities being night games. We would play hide and seek, a game called Ghosts in the Graveyard, and other games like that. On one instance, I was chosen to be the seeker for a hide and seek game. Because I was one of the younger cousins, I got a flashlight as an advantage. Normally, all the younger cousins hid close to the lodge, and the older cousins hid in the nearby trees or at the base of a nearby mountain. As I was searching near the bottom of the mountain, I heard a familiar whistle up the mountain just a bit. We would always whistle as a hint at our locations. It sounded like someone was hiding way up near a tree known as Underwear Tree, and you can guess why. So I began trekking up toward the whistle. As I climbed closer, I got an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I continued on warily and convinced myself that I would be fine. I hated walking in the night alone, but I figured whoever I found would walk me back to the lodge. As I neared the tree, I noticed that it was deathly silent. This alerted me that something was very wrong, because you could always hear the adults having fun back at the lodge. I was anxious to hurry back, so I called out, "I found you, Scott. Come back down with me." I got no reply, but I wasn't planning on waiting. As I began walking back down the path, I heard a voice call, "You almost had me." So I ran back up to investigate. I flashed my light in the branches of the tree and saw a monstrosity that was not my cousin. It looked like a poorly drawn stick figure made into a human with its emaciated figure and lifeless eyes. I remember its face looked like the skin on its head was being pulled from behind. It had torn and stretched, abnormal features. As soon as I saw the creature, I screamed, dropped the flashlight, and ran back to the lodge. The entire time I ran, I was overcome by an overpowering smell, and I could hear this thing running after me. As I approached the camp, I saw a few people, mainly my cousins, at the bottom of the mountain, waiting for me. I was crying and shaking, and they took me inside. I told my dad what had happened, but my cousins all said they didn't see anything following me. The adults kept us inside for the night, and I kept hearing sounds drifting from the mountains. I never played night games after that happened, and was always terrified that my cousins wouldn't listen to my warnings. Ever since that night, I have always felt uneasy up in those mountains. I used to be really religious and figured it was a demon of some kind trying to kill me or something like that, but those mountains have never felt the same after that incident. A few years ago, the game Until Dawn became really popular, and I watched a walkthrough of it on YouTube. When the Wendigo first appeared in the game, I got chills down my spine. It was exactly what I saw, and I did a ton of research on them. I figured someone must have gotten snowed in at that old lodge and resorted to cannibalism. But that doesn't explain what happened at Warm River. I still hear that screech from time to time, and it never occurred to me until watching Until Dawn that they might be from the same thing, and it scares the hell out of me every time. I heard it earlier tonight, and that's why I decided to finally write down my story. This has left me feeling extremely shook, and I'd love some opinions, especially from anyone with experience. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into the Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in the national parks and forests because it is so isolating, and me and my dog can roam freely there, free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy, rough drives into parks sometimes and lack of service and assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone service completely lost. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but I didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with the dirt and gravel. Yuck. My dog starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker. So I decided to continue at least a little bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find just a good place to camp. I continue to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be more than 5 to 10 miles an hour up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices. They sounded close, and I think I should call out to them. So I stop my car. But then I kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere. And I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for where voices could be coming from. I have never ran into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times. I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how my dog was acting on the way down. I was scared and focused on getting us out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing a sign of anybody. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself, and the voices could have been echoing off from somewhere far off. They just sounded so close. Animals die, glass gets broken. Nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm watching my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me, as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year. I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. Googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things out of the nature, hence my fascination in this little event. So my boyfriend and I were coming up on finishing our road trip just yesterday. There were only 2 to 3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts on YouTube. We went from No Sleep Podcast to The X-Files and ended up on a True Stories video dealing with Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog, playing Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly says what they are and casually mentions that they can mimic voices. I mean it when I say the most horrible chills I have ever had in my life crawl down my spine. I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me. I was probably close to a Wendigo. I do remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore, and the thought he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no. I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange, and I start Googling Wendigos. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they would live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is, "Another family goes missing in Mendocino." And I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they are all or a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remember looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and realized that these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found, on top of many which are just found dead. It just has my intuitions super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there terrifies me, and I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing, and do to this day. My dog and I are very close.
She was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing home from Costa Rica. So her little growls along the way makes me feel like there was something wrong. Even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I have done a lot of solo traveling, both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing much more solo traveling unless it's around a civilization. Does anyone know about authentic Native American lore, or has anyone else had a kind of inexplicable experience like this? I'm not sure if this is the right place for this, but I'm scared shitless either way. After hearing stories and looking stuff online, I'm fairly certain what I experienced was a Wendigo. Me and my son and my girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and, instead of confiscating our weapons, told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural voices and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself that there's no way. They're screwing with us. But I knew better. So we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby carrying backpacks, and my son started to get real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if someone had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back to our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck, and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature, and heard a loud, blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as it knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt toward us? Just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have said something like, "I need more children." My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what had happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be the older one, by at least a decade or so, pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not sure if it was what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a ranger, when suddenly, some rangers came into the cabin saying they couldn't find our son. My girlfriend starts to sob, and I start to hate myself, thinking I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All I know is that I don't have a son anymore, and I've never felt such despair and pain and emptiness in my life. I miss him, and if I can go back in time, I would take back that camping trip. My life has since never been the same. I'll always miss him.